Nobody expected Emma Sterling to show up at a livestock auction, let alone outbid a man twice her size. Voice shaking, but
2,000.
eyes steady, in front of a crowd hungry for deals and drama. Maybe Emma herself hadn't expected it either.
50,000!
The hot Texas afternoon pressed against her skin as she parked her battered sedan at the edge of the dusty lot, engine ticking, heart
You're a
even
brave one,
louder.
honey. That
It
horse
was
is a
only her
handful.
second week back in this town,
It's okay.
her
You're
mother's
safe with me
town, now nothing
We'll
but an
take it
echo,
slow.
and she still felt like a trespasser in her own story. She pulled her faded ball cap low, brushed crumbs from her jeans, and told herself this was just curiosity, just something to do. But as soon as she stepped onto the gravel, the noise and tension hit her like a wave. Voices barked numbers and names, cattle bellowed, dogs snapped at heels, and the sharp smell of sweat and hay and fear mixed in the heavy air. Emma moved through it all, invisible, unnoticed. Just another lost soul trying to keep moving. The auctioneer was already in full swing, his chant a staccato machine gun rhythm as he worked through a pen of goats. Emma lingered at the fence, feeling the rough wood under her fingers, pretending not to see the suspicious glances from men who remembered her mother. Maybe remembered Emma as a little girl, before college, before the marriage, before the divorce and the funeral and the sudden collapse of every plan she'd ever had. She had no intention of buying anything. She told herself that over and over, voice calm, logical, distant, the voice she'd used with students, with her ex-husband, with herself. Just look, she muttered, moving further down the line. Just watch. But then the horses came out, and everything changed. There was a nervous energy when the horses were brought through. Some local ranchers joked and haggled, while others kept their faces blank, unreadable. But as a battered old stock trailer rattled up, even the auctioneer paused. Out stepped a bay thoroughbred, tall, trembling, one leg swollen and bloodied, eyes wild with pain and something that looked like hope. The crowd murmured. A grizzled man in a stained cap, Cal Reynolds, the local kill buyer, sized up the horse and laughed. "He's dog food already," someone muttered, and there was a ripple of cruel humor, a sharp edge to it. Emma felt something twist inside her, old grief sharpening into anger. She tried to look away, couldn't. Then the horse saw her. Emma felt it like a jolt, those dark, liquid eyes fixing on her from across the ring, unblinking, full of silent questions. The world narrowed. The chant of the auctioneer blurred. The voices faded, and all Emma saw was the desperate intelligence behind that gaze. She didn't believe in omens or fate. She didn't believe in much of anything anymore. But in that moment, she felt chosen, not by logic or duty, but by something stranger, something wild. Bidding started low, and Cal didn't hesitate. His voice was mocking, certain of an easy win. 50, he barked, and the crowd laughed again. Emma's hand rose, almost of its own accord. 100, she said, quiet but clear. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. Cal shot her a look, half amusement, half scorn. "You don't want this one, lady," he said, voice oily. "Not unless you're looking for heartache?" Emma's jaw clenched. She looked back at the horse. Salem, she would later name him, and nodded, as if he'd already answered her doubts. 150, Cal called, grinning. 200, Emma said, louder now, her cheeks burning as a hush spread. Cal scowled, spat on the ground. 250. Emma's hands shook. She thought of her dwindling savings, her empty house, her mother's voice in memory. "You can't save them all, Emmy." But she raised her hand one more time. 300. A beat of silence. Cal glared at her, then at the horse, then shrugged, dismissing both. "She's crazy," someone called, laughter sharp and mean. The gavel came down. "Sold. To the lady in the back." The spell broke. Emma barely heard the rest. People whispered, some snickered. A few looked at her with something like pity. But Salem, he just stood there, head high, watching her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. A woman with sun-leathered skin sidled up to Emma as she signed the paperwork. "You're braver than most, hon," she said, not unkindly. "Or just stubborn." Emma managed a smile. Maybe both. Loading Salem into her old trailer was chaos. The bay horse startled at every noise, but with a gentle hand and whispered promises, Emma coaxed him up the ramp. When he stumbled, she steadied him. When he trembled, she stood beside him, refusing to flinch. As she pulled away from the auction, Salem in tow, Emma looked into the rearview mirror. The crowd, the dust, the jeering faces, they faded behind her. All that mattered was the strange, impossible connection she felt with the wounded horse in her care. For the first time in months, Emma didn't feel alone. Not exactly, but deep inside, a new fear took root. What if saving Salem wasn't the act of compassion she thought? What if it was the beginning of something she couldn't control? Night was falling as she turned onto the long, empty road home, heart pounding with both dread and hope, Salem's dark silhouette flickering in the twilight. The drive home was long, the Texas sun bleeding into a copper dusk as Emma navigated the winding road, Salem's injured leg shifting in the trailer behind her. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, heart skipping every time she saw his head silhouetted in the fading light. Each turn of the road pulled her further away from the world she once knew and deeper into the unknown she'd invited by bringing Salem home. As she pulled up to the old Sterling ranch, the sky was painted with streaks of lavender and indigo. The house stood quiet, 2 stories of peeling white paint and memories. Beyond the house, the old barn loomed like a shadow, battered by wind and years of storms. The land had been empty for months, wild grass creeping up around the porch and barn doors. It felt both abandoned and watched, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. Emma led Salem out of the trailer slowly, whispering to him as his hooves clattered on the ramp. The other horses in the pasture, a pair of rescues her mother had once taken in, snorted and tossed their heads, eyes wide, spooked by Salem's arrival. One of them, a gray mare named June, whinnied sharply and bolted to the far end of the fence, as if the newcomer carried some scent of disaster. But Salem seemed utterly calm in Emma's presence. He followed her with a strange, measured patience, even as pain radiated from his wounded leg. She led him to the far stall, one her mother had called the healing stall, a space filled with old horseshoes, bundles of sage, and faded ribbons. As Emma laid out fresh hay and clean water, Salem watched her intently, never blinking, as if he was memorizing her every move. That night, fatigue pressed on Emma's shoulders, but sleep wouldn't come easy. The ranch was too quiet, the wind sighing through broken window screens. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering candle, thinking about her mother's stories, tales of the wild, the sacred, the things best left unspoken. She tried to dismiss them as childhood nonsense, but something about Salem's eyes made her uneasy. Sometime after midnight, Emma wandered to the barn with a flashlight, checking on her new charge. Salem was standing in his stall, head lowered, but as Emma entered, he lifted his gaze and looked straight at her. The beam of her flashlight caught the gleam in his eyes, They seemed almost silver in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight that streamed through a crack in the roof. Suddenly, a gust of wind rattled the barn door. Emma jumped, pulse quickening. The other horses stamped nervously in their stalls, ears pinned back. But Salem remained perfectly still, even as the shadows shifted around him. His calm felt unnatural, almost unsettling. Emma's skin prickled as she stepped closer. The straw beneath Salem's feet was pressed into deep, odd-shaped prints, far deeper than a horse his size should make. She knelt down, fingers brushing the strange indentations. They were misshapen, wider at the front, as if the hoof itself was warped or changing. She pulled her hand back, unnerved. As Emma left the barn, she heard a series of eerie animal calls echoing from the woods beyond the pasture. Long, wavering cries. Not quite coyote, not quite owl. They made the hairs on her neck stand on end. She hurried back to the house, locking the doors behind her, trying to ignore the cold sense of being watched. Sleep, when it came, was full of restless dreams, dark figures moving through the grass, her mother's voice warning her to mind the old ways, and Salem's eyes, always Salem's eyes, following her everywhere. Morning brought little comfort. Over breakfast, Emma tried to shake off the strange dreams. She made coffee, fed the dogs, and opened the curtains to a sky streaked with clouds. As she headed outside, she found her neighbor waiting by the front gate. Mrs. Haywood had lived on the next ranch for 50 years, a thin, sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for gossip and a head full of old country tales. She leaned against the fence, arms folded, eyes narrowing as she spotted Salem in the distance. "Heard you bought that bay horse from the auction," she called, voice laced with skepticism. Emma nodded, trying to keep her tone light. "He needed a home. Nobody else wanted him." Mrs. Haywood shook her head, lips pursed. "Sometimes there's a reason, you know. Sometimes things come up for sale that shouldn't be bought." Emma tried to laugh it off, but her voice sounded hollow. "He's just a horse. A bit battered, but—" "Not all horses are just horses," Mrs. Haywood cut in, voice dropping. "You ever hear the stories? About the ones that wander in from nowhere, calm as ghosts. But they leave trouble behind." Emma felt a chill run through her. "I don't believe in superstitions." Mrs. Haywood leaned closer, her face serious. "You ought to. Around here we've got tales, bad omens, shapeshifters, horses that stare at the moon and never cast the right kind of shadow. Your mama knew all those stories. She kept you safe from them." Emma forced a smile, but unease gnawed at her. As Mrs. Haywood walked away, she called over her shoulder, "Just be careful. Some things come to test us, not to be tamed." Emma stood by the fence for a long moment, watching Salem grazing in the morning light. He seemed so ordinary now, tail flicking at flies. But every so often he'd pause, lift his head, and stare directly at the horizon. Ears pricked, body tense, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. That night, Emma found herself back at the barn, drawn by a sense of duty and curiosity she couldn't explain. Salem stood quietly, facing the window where the moon poured silver across the stall. He didn't move, but his shadow flickered on the wall, distorted and restless. Emma pressed her hand to the old wood, heart heavy with questions. In the distance, the woods whispered, and the wind rattled loose shingles on the roof. She stared at Salem's profile, watched the rise and fall of his breath, and tried to convince herself that everything was normal. Everything could be explained. But the longer she stood in the cold barn, the more she felt the thin line between reason and the unknown begin to blur. And in that silent moment, Emma realized something. She hadn't just rescued a broken animal. She had invited a mystery into her life, one that might never be tamed. The next morning, the world outside Emma's window was washed in gentle gray light, dew beating on every blade of wild grass. The air still held the chill of the night before, and Emma wrapped herself in a faded flannel as she stepped out onto the porch. For a moment, all seemed peaceful. Birds called from the thickets, a light breeze ruffled the leaves, and the distant hills glowed pale beneath the slow-rising sun. For the first time since her return, Emma felt almost like she belonged. She settled into a rhythm over the next several days. There was comfort in routine, in tasks that required steady hands and patient attention. Every morning, she rose before dawn, made strong coffee, and headed out to the barn to check on Salem. She'd move quietly through the stalls, murmuring greetings to June and the other horses, always saving Salem for last. There was something about his stillness, his quiet watchfulness, that demanded respect. Salem's wound was gruesome, a deep gash along his foreleg, rimmed with old blood and swelling. Emma cleaned it gently, talking to him the whole time, her voice soft and soothing even when her nerves frayed. He barely flinched. Some mornings he seemed to anticipate her movements, shifting his weight so she could tend the worst of it. She grew used to the scent of iodine, the tug of gauze, the faint shiver that ran through her whenever she pressed too hard. Outside, the land was coming back to life. Emma mended fences and cleared tangled brush, sometimes catching Salem watching her from the edge of the paddock, his eyes dark and unreadable. He seemed content to graze alone, apart from the others, but every so often he'd draw near, close enough for Emma to feel the warmth of his breath on her arm. She'd never been good at small talk, even with people, but she found herself telling Salem everything, the mundane details of her day, stray memories from childhood, old frustrations and new hopes. Sometimes, when the sun was high and the world quiet, she'd bring a folding chair to the barn and sit beside Salem's stall, reading aloud from worn paperbacks or her mother's favorite poetry. The words echoed through the rafters, mixing with the sounds of shifting hooves and creaking wood. Salem would stand perfectly still, head lowered, as if he understood every syllable. On these afternoons, peace crept in around the edges. Emma found herself remembering the rituals her mother had cherished, the way she'd scatter cornmeal at the barn door for good luck, the soft singing she'd do while brushing the horses. The memories stung, but also soothed, grounding Emma in something older than her own sorrow. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit in her mother's old rocker and listen to the wind, half expecting to hear a familiar voice drift in with the prairie's sigh. But the peace was uneasy. The other horses never quite relaxed around Salem. June, usually friendly and bold, kept her distance, watching Salem with wary eyes and twitching ears. The dogs wouldn't go near his stall, barking furiously at the slightest sound. Emma tried to rationalize it. New horses always took time to settle in, but a knot of worry stayed tight in her chest. She noticed small, unsettling things, the way Salem's shadow sometimes stretched oddly across the stall, or how he'd freeze for minutes at a time, ears pricked toward some silent signal in the night. Once, she found a pile of fresh sage leaves near his gate, as if someone, or something, had placed them there as an offering or warning. On the third night, Emma woke with a start. The house was dark, the old clock ticking loudly in the hallway. She had the strange feeling she'd been called, not by a sound, but by a pull in her chest. Wrapping herself in a blanket, she padded out to the barn, the grass cold and slick beneath her bare feet. Salem was awake, standing in the center of his stall, head lifted to the moonlight. The wound on his leg seemed smaller in the pale glow, edges less angry, but Emma couldn't shake the sense that she was seeing something impossible. She stood there a long while, letting the silence settle between them. After that night, Emma began to feel a faint flicker of hope. There was still so much she didn't understand. About the land, about Salem, about herself. But the routines gave her purpose, a reason to get up each day. She wrote in her mother's old journal, sketching little notes about Salem's progress and the ranch's slow renewal. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and violet, Emma brought a battered book of Texas legends to the barn. She sat cross-legged in the straw, Salem standing close enough to touch. She read aloud stories of wild mustangs, ghost horses, and the unseen spirits that moved through the grasslands at dusk. Salem listened, never moving, eyes half-lidded, as if he was drifting somewhere between worlds. She closed the book and leaned her head against the wooden beam, breathing in the warm, earthy smell of horse and hay. For a moment, the grief of her divorce, the ache of her mother's absence, all the tangled questions faded. In their place was a quiet certainty, a sense that, whatever else might come, she and Salem were in this together. The days blurred into each other, each one edged with a little more peace, a little less fear. But always, beneath the surface, Emma felt the tension coil, an unease that sometimes crept in with the dusk, or in the chill before dawn. When the world seemed both impossibly big and heartbreakingly small. She couldn't name the feeling, not yet. All she knew was that Salem had brought change to her life. Change that was beautiful, bewildering, and just a little bit dangerous. And for the first time in a long while, Emma was willing to see where it might lead. The days passed in a hazy blend of chores and quiet, each one folding gently into the next. Emma found comfort in this simple rhythm, but a persistent restlessness grew within her, tugging her thoughts back to the questions that hovered around Salem. There was something about him, a presence, a watchfulness, that kept her both grounded and unsettled, as if she was living inside a riddle with no answer. On a chilly morning, while cleaning the barn, Emma found herself reaching for a broom in the far corner of the tack room. As she shifted aside a dusty crate, something small and leather-bound tumbled to the floor with a dull thud. She bent down, heart quickening, and picked up an old diary, her mother's, she realized, recognizing the looping handwriting embossed on the front. The edges were frayed, the cover worn smooth by years of handling, and a faded pink ribbon still marked a page somewhere near the middle. Emma wiped the dust away, her fingers trembling. She carried the diary out to the porch, settling into her mother's old rocking chair. The sun had just crested the trees, filling the sky with golden light. The world felt still and expectant. She opened the diary, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The first entries were mundane, grocery lists, weather notes, reminders about fence repairs and vet appointments. But as she read further, the tone shifted. Her mother wrote of dreams and half-remembered stories, of things she'd seen and heard in the stillness of night. "There is more to this land than fences and fields," one entry began. "Sometimes I hear the old ones whisper when the wind comes up from the south. They talk of horses with eyes that see beyond, of creatures that walk between worlds. I keep watch, as Mama taught me." Emma paused, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the pages slowly, the words growing stranger and more urgent. Sketches of horses with elongated faces and wide, luminous eyes filled the margins. Her mother wrote about the moon, about shadows that moved where there shouldn't be any, and about the importance of respecting the wild, the sacred, and the unknown. One passage was circled in blue ink, the lines jagged as if written in a hurry. Last night I saw it again. The bay, the one with the crooked blaze. It watched me from the trees. When I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice. Do not turn your back on the things you do not understand. The land remembers everything. So do the horses. Emma leaned back, rocked gently, and closed her eyes, letting her mother's words settle deep. The truth was, she'd always felt something unusual about the ranch. The sense of being watched, of secrets buried just beneath the surface. It was as if the land itself was alive, full of memory and intent. That night, after feeding Salem and the others, Emma brought the diary out to the barn. She read aloud by the soft glow of a lantern, her voice quiet but steady. Salem stood at the front of his stall, ears pricked forward, eyes following her every move. As she read, she felt an odd warmth growing between them, like the faint current of an unspoken conversation. Afterward, Emma sat cross-legged in the straw, staring at the sketches her mother had made. Some showed horses half-shrouded in mist, others with strange markings on their faces, runic symbols, crescent moons, swirling spirals. There were pages where the handwriting grew wild, nearly illegible, as if her mother had been writing through a storm. Outside, the wind picked up, making the barn creak and groan. June and the other horses shifted restlessly, nickering and stamping as if sensing a storm or something deeper. But Salem stood silent, unmoving, his eyes reflecting the lantern light like twin coins. As Emma watched him, she noticed something strange. The wound on Salem's leg, which she tended so carefully, was changing. The edges were no longer raw and angry but were closing, the skin knitting together at a pace that made no sense. It should have taken weeks, maybe months, for such a wound to heal. Yet each night the swelling lessened, the cut shrank, and the angry red faded to a faint pink line. Emma found herself both relieved and unsettled. She told herself it was her care. Good feed, clean bandages, quiet attention. That was making the difference. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Sometimes she'd catch Salem staring at her with a look so intense, so knowing, that it felt as though he could see right through her. One evening, as dusk stretched long blue shadows across the pasture, Emma lingered in the barn after turning out the lights. She heard faint whispers from the woods. Just the wind, she told herself, or maybe an owl. But the sound seemed to carry words, fragments of old lullabies her mother used to hum. She pressed her hand against Salem's neck, feeling the steady thud of his heartbeat. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. "Why do I feel like I know you from some other life?" Salem lowered his head, brushing his muzzle softly against her shoulder. In that moment, Emma felt the weight of her grief lighten just a little. The world seemed to widen, old pain softening into curiosity, loneliness blooming into connection. That night, she dreamed of running wild through tall grass, her hair tangled, her laughter echoing across the hills. Beside her, a bay horse raced, its eyes bright with mischief, its hooves thundering against the earth. She woke with the taste of freedom on her tongue, a sense that, for the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she was meant to be. But as the days grew shorter and the nights stretched longer, the air on the ranch seemed to change. Emma felt it, a charge beneath her skin, a pulse in the earth. The diary sat on her nightstand, its pages full of warnings and wonder. Salem's wound healed with impossible speed, his presence growing stronger, more enigmatic, as if he was waiting for her to ask the right question. Emma told herself she was ready for whatever came next. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought would come at a price, and that the line between memory and magic was thinner than she'd ever imagined. The autumn night settled over the ranch with an uneasy hush, thick clouds blotting out the stars, and a restless wind scraping dead leaves along the porch. Emma moved through the house with a heaviness in her limbs, weighed down by thoughts she couldn't quite name. She paused at the back window, mug of lukewarm tea cradled in her hands, and peered into the darkness. The barn lights glowed softly at the edge of the yard, casting long, angular shadows across the grass. Somewhere beyond the pastures, a coyote howled, the sound sharp and distant. Emma pressed her palm to the cold glass, trying to anchor herself to something solid. The evening had been uneventful. Chores, supper, a few pages from her mother's diary, and a silent dinner interrupted only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock. But beneath that surface calm, a low thrum of anxiety simmered, growing stronger with each hour. She told herself she was being foolish. Salem had been improving every day. His wound nearly vanished now, his coat glossy and rich in the lantern light. He ate well, stood quietly when she cleaned his stall, and greeted her with that same gentle stillness that felt both comforting and uncanny. The other horses were slowly adjusting, their fear mellowing into wary tolerance. Even Mrs. Haywood hadn't stopped by with more ominous tales, and Emma had almost convinced herself things might finally be settling down. But as midnight approached, a storm rolled in, sheets of rain battering the roof, thunder rumbling across the sky. Emma lay in bed, eyes open in the darkness, listening to the rain pound the windows. She tried to drift off, but a nagging sense of something unfinished, something off, kept her restless. Lightning cracked, illuminating the bedroom in stark white. Emma sat up, heart pounding. Was that a sound from the barn? She strained her ears. Yes, there it was. A distant clang, like a stall door swinging open. Goosebumps prickled along her arms. Maybe just the wind, she tried to reassure herself, but instinct sent her scrambling out of bed. She threw on a coat over her pajamas, jammed her feet into boots, and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the hallway drawer. The rain slammed against her as she sprinted across the yard, mud sucking at her heels. Each step felt heavier than the last, dread knotting her stomach. She pushed open the barn door, breathless and soaked, sweeping the flashlight beam over the stalls. June and the other horses pressed themselves against the far wall, nostrils flared, eyes rolling with unease. Salem's stall stood empty, the gate latched shut from the inside. Emma froze. How was that possible? Her heart hammered, the flashlight trembling in her grip. Salem? Her voice was swallowed by the storm. She fumbled with the latch and stumbled into the empty stall. The straw was scattered, damp with fresh mud. Emma's gaze dropped to the ground, and her breath caught. There. Hoof prints. But not quite right. They were wider, deeper. The shapes distorted as if something far heavier, or stranger, had passed through. The prints glistened, water pooling in their depths, and led straight through the back wall of the barn. Emma followed, senses blurring into a fevered urgency. The storm battered her, wind snatching at her hair, rain blinding her. She stumbled around the side of the barn, searching desperately for any sign. The prince continued, weaving through the grass and vanishing at the edge of the woods, where the trees clustered like dark sentinels. For a split second, the lightning lit up the world, and there, at the edge of the trees, she saw him. Salem, standing utterly still, framed by shifting shadows. His head was raised, ears pricked, eyes reflecting the lightning's silver fire. He seemed almost to shimmer in the rain, his form wavering at the edges like a mirage. Emma called out again, voice cracking. "Salem, please!" He didn't move. The woods behind him seemed to breathe, alive with rustling branches and the eerie chorus of unseen animals. Then, with another flash, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. Emma's feet dragged her forward, the flashlight beam quivering over tangled roots and slick leaves. The hoofprints continued, impossibly clear, deeper now, leading her into the trees. With every step, the woods seemed to close in, the storm fading to a muffled roar overhead. She felt something cold brush her cheek. A branch? Or a hand? She flinched, nearly dropping the flashlight. Her thoughts spun. Was this just an animal spooked by the storm, or something else entirely? The whispers from her mother's diary circled in her mind. Do not turn your back on the things you do not understand. The old stories, horses that weren't really horses, omens, spirits, felt too close, too real. The beam of her flashlight caught on something pale and flickering, a tuft of Salem's mane snagged on a low-hanging branch. She reached out, fingers trembling, and felt the coarse hair, damp and real. A wave of relief mingled with dread. He was close. But what else was out here with them? She pressed on, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The deeper she went, the more the woods changed. The path beneath her feet twisted. The ground grew soft and spongy and strange. Echoing animal sounds came from all sides. Her breath fogged in the cold air, and she realized she was shivering, more from fear than the rain. Suddenly a shape darted across her path, low and quick. Emma gasped, stumbling back, flashlight swinging wildly. For a heartbeat she thought she saw eyes gleaming in the dark, too high off the ground, too bright, watching her. But when she blinked, the vision was gone. She stopped, breath ragged, and forced herself to listen. There, hooves, slow and deliberate, moving deeper into the darkness. Something told her not to follow, that she was leaving safety behind. But another voice, her own or her mother's, she couldn't say, whispered, "Some things come to test us, not to be tamed." She gripped the flashlight tighter, wiped the rain from her face, and stepped forward. The storm faded behind her. The world narrowed to the circle of pale light at her feet, and the impossible hoofprints leading her onward, deeper into the heart of the unknown. Emma had always believed she could think her way through anything, explain everything. But tonight, every step took her further from certainty, and closer to a mystery older and wilder than anything she'd ever known. Emma's breath billowed in the damp air as she stepped past the last fence post and into the woods, flashlight slicing thin arcs through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, branches dripping with rain, leaves trembling with every gust of wind. Thunder rumbled far off, the storm now a low growl somewhere behind her. With each footfall, the familiar world of the ranch faded until it was only a faint memory behind her. Just her, the storm's aftershock, and the strange trail she could not ignore. The hoofprints led her onward, deep and erratic, sometimes doubling back, sometimes crossing their own path, as if Salem, or whatever Salem had become, was uncertain, or perhaps deliberately confusing the way. Every now and then, Emma would pause, listening for movement, but the woods answered with only the creak of branches and the whisper of unseen things. The further she went, the more the world behind her seemed to dissolve. Her legs ached, her boots squelched in the mud, but she pressed on, guided by a mixture of dread and desperate hope. A thick fog began to rise from the ground, swirling around her knees, cold and clammy. The beam from her flashlight bounced off the mist, creating weird, shifting shadows that danced between the tree trunks. The sounds of the night grew stranger, animal calls she couldn't identify, the distant crackle of twigs underfoot, soft murmurs that might have been wind or something else entirely. Emma shivered, pulling her jacket tighter, but there was no turning back now. She had to find Salem. Sometimes, in the half-light, she caught glimpses of movement ahead, an ear flicking behind a tree, the flash of a dark tail, the quick, silent shape of a horse slipping between the shadows. "Salem," she called, her voice swallowed by the fog. "Come on, boy. Come home." No answer. But she felt it, the sense of being watched, not just by Salem, but by the woods themselves, as if every old tree and twisted root was an eye turned in her direction, silently judging her intrusion. She stumbled across a shallow creek, the water icy as it soaked through her boots. The prints continued on the other side, impossibly clear. She followed deeper now, the woods thickening until the sky was little more than a tangle of black branches above. Her flashlight flickered, the battery warning her with a weak pulse, and panic crept in. She tried to shake it off, whispering, "You've been through worse. Just keep moving." For a moment, she let herself remember being a girl, running wild across the fields while her mother called warnings from the porch. "Don't wander too far, Emmy. Mind the old fence. Don't follow the shadows after dark." At the time, it had seemed like superstition, a mother's worry dressed up as legend. Now, in the heart of the woods, those warnings echoed with new meaning. The fog thickened, pressing in until Emma could barely see the path ahead. She reached out, fingertips brushing the rough bark of a tree for balance. The trunk was slick and cold. Under her palm she felt strange markings, rough carved lines spiraling upward. She traced them, heart thudding. The symbols matched those from her mother's diary: a crescent moon, a wild-eyed horse, a spiral that seemed to draw her gaze inward. The world spun for a moment, and Emma jerked her hand away, breath ragged. A sudden burst of movement caught her eye. There, just ahead, Salem's dark form darted between the trees, almost glowing in the fog. He moved with an eerie grace, hooves silent on the wet ground. His mane streamed behind him, impossibly long, blending with the mist. "Salem!" Emma called again, stumbling after him. She pushed forward, branches scraping her face, mud clinging to her legs. The woods grew denser, the air heavier. It was hard to breathe. Shapes flickered at the edges of her vision, antlered shadows, glowing eyes, silent birds perched on branches that seemed to sway toward her. Emma's heart hammered. Was she chasing Salem or being led? The question coiled through her mind, tightening with each step. She stopped to catch her breath, chest burning. The silence was almost total now, thick and absolute, broken only by her own heartbeat and the hiss of her breath. Then, a whisper, a real, human voice. Her mother's, soft and urgent, drifting through the mist. "Don't lose yourself, Emma. Remember who you are." Emma blinked, fighting back tears. She was losing her grip on the boundary between memory and reality, dream and waking. But she forced herself forward. She would not turn back. Not until she knew the truth. The fog parted briefly, revealing a small clearing ringed with ancient oaks. In the center stood Salem, perfectly still, head lifted toward the moon. The wound on his leg was gone, not even a scar left behind. His eyes shone with an intelligence that was not quite animal, not quite human, something older, something wild. Emma stepped into the clearing, her legs trembling. She felt the woods watching. Holding its breath, Salem turned to face her. For a moment time slowed. The world hushed, the mist hanging motionless. Emma stared into Salem's eyes, searching for the horse she'd saved, the gentle soul she'd come to trust. But what looked back at her was something more. A being ancient and vast, wearing Salem's shape, but carrying a mystery she could not name. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice failed. Instead, she reached out, hand trembling. Salem moved forward, closing the distance between them. His breath brushed her cheek, warm and electric. For an instant, Emma saw herself reflected in his eyes, small, lost, but unafraid. A sound rose from the woods then, a chorus of whispers, animal cries, and human voices merging in a wild, haunting song. The trees shuddered, shadows swirling, the ground itself seeming to pulse with hidden life. Emma closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She felt herself pulled in every direction, toward fear, toward wonder, toward something she could never understand. When she opened her eyes, Salem was gone. The clearing was empty, silent except for the rain. Emma sank to her knees, exhaustion crashing over her. She had lost Salem, lost herself in the fog and the shadows. But in the quiet that followed, a strange peace crept in. She knew somehow that this night had changed her forever, that she had crossed a boundary, left something behind, and brought something new back with her. She stood slowly, brushing mud from her hands, and turned back toward the path. The woods seemed less threatening now, the darkness not quite so deep. The way home would not be easy, but she knew she was not alone. Something watched over her, walked beside her, unseen but real. Emma stepped into the shadows, heading home. The night was full of secrets, but she was ready to face whatever came next. For a long moment, Emma wandered through the woods in a fog, her sense of direction gone, boots squelching through mud and fallen leaves. She kept calling Salem's name, voice cracking, but there was only silence. No answering whinny, no sound but the wind and the faint, mournful song of night insects. Still, she pressed on, driven by a stubborn mixture of fear, love, and something else she couldn't name. The air was thick, every breath cool and metallic. Shadows flickered between the trees. The world felt both impossibly large and suffocatingly close. Suddenly, she stumbled into a clearing she hadn't seen before, heart thumping. The mist seemed to pause, suspended in the air, and the ancient oaks stood in a perfect ring. In the center, Salem waited, but he was changed. Moonlight poured down, washing the clearing in silver. Salem stood taller than she remembered, his coat shining like wet stone. His eyes caught the moonlight and reflected it back, bright as lanterns, impossible, mesmerizing. Emma felt her chest tighten, awe and terror warring inside her. She stepped closer, unable to look away. Salem. Her voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. Salem met her gaze, and for the first time she saw not fear or pain, but intelligence. Vast, ageless, almost human, and yet far more. He bowed his head, mane tumbling forward, and took a step toward her. The ground seemed to hum under his hooves, as if the earth itself recognized him. Emma reached out a shaking hand. Suddenly, Salem's lips moved. Impossible, but undeniable. His voice echoed through the clearing, deep and thunderous, filling the air with a sound both ancient and new. "You did not save me, Emma. I chose you." Emma gasped, stumbling back, heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. Her mind reeled. She tried to rationalize it, explain it away as exhaustion or fever, but the world wouldn't let her. The woods grew utterly silent, waiting for her response. She managed to speak, her voice trembling. "What are you? How is this?" Salem stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, both comforting and terrifying. "You know the stories. You heard them all your life. The old ones walk these lands. Some take the shape of storms or rivers or horses. Some come to test the living, to remind them of what's been forgotten." Emma remembered her mother's diary, the warnings scribbled in the margins, the sketches of horses with strange, wise eyes. A memory surfaced, her mother sitting on the porch at dusk, braiding Emma's hair, whispering, "We're not alone here. The wild still speaks, if you know how to listen." She blinked hard, fighting tears. "Why me?" Salem's eyes softened. "Not all are chosen. Some turn away from the unknown, cling to what's safe. But you, your grief, your love, your willingness to care for what others abandoned, these opened the way. You followed when others would have fled." Flashbacks flickered across Emma's mind, memories she hadn't visited in years. The long nights sitting by her mother's bedside, the guilt and loneliness after her divorce, the quiet determination that had brought her back to this place. She realized she had always felt tested by life, by loss, by the need to find meaning in a world that so often felt empty. "But I'm just," Emma began, but Salem cut her off gently. "Just a woman," he finished. "Just a daughter, a caretaker, a seeker. That's all any of us are. And sometimes, that's enough." A chill wind swept the clearing. The moonlight brightened, shadows twisting into strange shapes along the ground. Emma felt the boundary between herself and the world growing thin, as if one more step might send her tumbling into a place where nothing made sense, where myth and memory were the same. Salem lowered his head, his voice quieter now. "You can return to your old life, Emma, or you can choose to see, to honor the wild, the sacred, the unseen. The path is yours." Emma's throat ached. She was afraid of what she might lose, of what she might become. But a deeper fear stirred, the fear of closing herself off, of refusing the mystery that had always hovered at the edge of her life. She thought of her mother's last words, spoken with fierce love. "The world is bigger and stranger than we can bear. Promise me you'll never stop looking." She closed her eyes, tears running down her cheeks, and whispered, "I want to understand. I want to remember." As if in response, the woods came alive. Shadows danced, the wind singing in the branches. Salem circled her, his coat shimmering, and everywhere his hooves touched the ground, wildflowers bloomed, pale blue, luminous, fragile. The scent of sage and earth rose in the air. Emma felt a jolt of energy, a sense of being both very small and deeply connected to everything around her. She knelt in the grass, pressing her palms to the cool earth, and let herself weep. Tears of fear, of release, of awe. Salem nuzzled her shoulder, his breath warm and real. Remember this, Emma. The answers are not always clear. Some mysteries exist only to be honored. As the first rays of dawn crept over the trees, the clearing faded, the moonlight giving way to ordinary light. Salem stepped back, his form shimmering, growing indistinct at the edges, until he was little more than a shadow between the trees. Emma stood, wiping her face. The woods felt changed. The air charged with something holy. She turned for home, heart pounding with wonder and dread, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. And behind her, at the edge of the clearing, Salem's eyes glowed once more, watching, waiting, a silent promise that the story was not over, that the wild, the sacred, and the unknown would always walk beside her. Dawn crept in slow and uncertain, painting the woods in shifting shades of blue and gold. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, skin tingling from the encounter with Salem and the strange, haunting song of the night. The world was so quiet now she could hear her own breath, feel the tremble in her legs, the wild hammer of her heart. The hush felt sacred, as if the land itself waited for her decision. Emma wiped her face with trembling hands, the cool dew dampening her palms. She could still sense Salem near, maybe not in sight, but in the way the shadows clung to the trees, the subtle energy humming in the roots beneath her boots. For a moment, she let herself believe she could simply return to her old life, go home, feed the horses, sweep the porch, and pretend the night had been nothing more than a fevered dream. But she knew, bone deep, that was impossible. She knelt in the grass, letting her fingers trail through wildflowers that had sprung up where Salem's hooves had pressed the earth. The petals were cool, almost iridescent in the growing light, and their fragrance mingled with the sharp scent of sage. Each breath felt heavier, as if the air itself was thick with questions. Why me? Why now? The words spilled from her lips, barely louder than a sigh. Emma pressed her palm to her chest, searching for courage. She thought of her mother, her laughter, her warnings, her quiet faith that the world was more than what eyes could see. Emma had never believed those stories fully, always favoring logic and reason. But now she felt their truth curling through her veins. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. A flicker of movement caught her eye. At the far edge of the clearing, Salem stood again, watching. His coat shimmered between shadow and sunlight, his eyes steady, patient. He didn't move, but Emma felt the invitation as surely as if he had spoken. Choose. For a moment, Emma's mind filled with doubts. What if she was losing her grip, her sense of reality? What if this was just exhaustion, stress, some trick of the mind brought on by loneliness and too many restless nights? But she remembered the impossible healing of Salem's wound, the ancient symbols carved into the trees, her mother's diary full of warnings and wonder. She remembered the voice that had echoed in the clearing, the certainty that she was being offered a choice, not just about a horse, but about her life. She stood slowly, brushing the grass from her knees, and looked at Salem. Her voice came out steady, though her heart still quaked. What happens if I say yes? If I accept what I can't explain? Salem's eyes shone brighter, the light deepening as if the whole world leaned in to listen. The wind picked up, swirling around Emma, carrying with it the scents of rain and earth and wild old things. Salem stepped closer, his hooves leaving fresh prints in the dew. For a moment, Emma thought she saw shapes moving in the mist. Horses with eyes like lanterns, women draped in shawls, children laughing and vanishing into the trees. You'll never see the world the same way. Salem's voice rumbled in her mind, soft but unyielding. You'll carry the memory of this night for the rest of your days. The mystery will walk beside you, sometimes as a comfort, sometimes as a burden. You will understand things others can't, and you will lose the certainty that kept you safe. Emma swallowed, a thrill of terror and longing flooding her. She saw her life, her failed marriage, her empty home, her days of aching grief laid out before her, a map she could never quite follow. She thought of the feelings she'd had since returning to the ranch, that she was being called to something larger, something wild and essential. She could go back to her routines, close her heart, pretend the world was only what she could touch and see. Or she could step forward, open herself to the unknown, and trust that even unanswered questions could be sacred. Her hands trembled, but her voice was clear. I want to live honestly, even if it means not knowing everything. I want to respect what I don't understand. Salem lowered his head, and Emma reached out, her fingers tangling in his mane. For an instant, the woods shimmered, colors brightening, sounds intensifying, every heartbeat echoing with possibility. Emma felt as if she'd stepped into the center of the world, where all things were connected. Her pain, her hope, the stories of her mother, the song of the wind, the ancient promise of the land. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling fill her. I choose to return, but I choose to carry this with me. I won't forget. A warmth spread through her chest, not gentle but fierce, as if the sun itself had settled beneath her ribs. The wind quieted, the wildflowers nodding as if in agreement. Salem nuzzled her shoulder, his breath sweet and electric. Then remember this, Emma. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Let them live in you. Let them change you. The clearing faded around her, the mist rolling in, and Emma felt herself shifting, becoming more solid, more present, even as the echoes of the night lingered in her blood. When she opened her eyes, Salem was gone. Only the hoof prints and a scattering of wildflowers remained, shining in the new morning light. Emma turned toward home, the path somehow clearer than before. She knew nothing would be easy. Life would still ache, and loss would come again. But she was not afraid. She walked with the memory of wonder at her side, with respect for all she could not understand. And behind her, where the trees met the light, the shadows flickered, gentle, watchful, promising that she was never truly alone. Emma stood at the edge of the pasture, arms folded against the early morning chill, the memory of her night in the woods still alive in every nerve. The sun was just beginning to crest the far hills, gilding the land in gentle gold. Salem grazed nearby, calm and utterly ordinary once again, his coat catching the light. The other horses nickered softly in the distance. On the surface, everything looked unchanged, but inside Emma, nothing was as it had been. She found herself drawn, again and again, to the questions that had haunted her since she returned to the ranch. Why do some mysteries call to us? Why do we search for answers when the questions themselves are what shape us? She'd always been hungry for knowledge. Books, facts, logic, plans. Control had been her armor, especially after her marriage fell apart, after her mother died, and the world no longer made sense. But standing in the pale morning light, Emma saw her old certainties with new eyes. She watched the way Salem moved, the tilt of his head, the deep intelligence behind his gaze. Had she really saved him? Or had he found her, tested her, offered her something she didn't know she needed? She sat on the split-rail fence, her mother's diary open in her lap. The pages fluttered in the breeze, full of stories and warnings, sketches and half-finished poems. She read her mother's words again. Sometimes, what we think we save is actually what tests and shapes us. It rang true in a way it never had before. Looking up at the sky, Emma spoke quietly, as if to the land itself. We always want to explain things, to name them, box them up, make them safe. But the most important things, love, grief, wonder, the wild, can't be controlled. She thought of her students, back when she taught at the university. She remembered their hunger for certainty, the comfort they took in tidy explanations. She'd been the same once, chasing the right answers, terrified of not knowing, believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could understand everything. Now she realized wisdom was something different. A willingness to live with questions, to let some mysteries remain unsolved. Emma's mind drifted back to that night in the woods, the moment she'd seen Salem change, the voice that echoed in her mind, the feeling of being chosen. She remembered the terror and the awe, the strange sense of peace that came when she stopped struggling to make sense of it all. The lesson was clear. The world was full of things beyond her grasp, and it was okay not to understand. She closed the diary, feeling the grain of the leather cover. Her mother's handwriting, looping and strong, was a connection across years, loss, and unspoken love. Emma felt the weight of that legacy, not as a burden, but as a gift. Respect for the wild, the mysterious, the ancient is essential, her mother had written. Trying to dominate them leads to ruin. She saw now how true that was, not just in stories, but in life. Her need for control had cost her so much. Years of tension in her marriage, a stubborn refusal to let others help, even the aching loneliness she carried after her mother's death. In trying to master her pain, she'd closed herself off from the possibility of healing. Emma let the morning wash over her. She breathed deep, filling her lungs with cold, clean air, and felt something inside her loosen, a knot of old fear and sorrow finally coming undone. She was not the same woman who had returned to this ranch weeks ago, weighed down by grief and guilt. She was more present now, more willing to trust what she could not see or touch. She stood and walked over to Salem, reaching out to run her hand along his neck. He leaned into her, gentle and solid. Emma laughed softly, a sound full of relief and release. "You're just a horse now, aren't you?" she murmured, though she suspected that was only half the truth. In the days that followed, Emma found herself living more slowly, more openly. She spent hours outside, watching the sunrise, tending to chores, listening to the wind and the birds. She talked to the land, to her mother's memory, to the horses, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silent gratitude. Each day felt like a conversation with the unknown, an ongoing dance with the questions she had once tried so hard to answer. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, Mrs. Haywood, with her endless stories and sharp eyes, or old Mr. Carter, who brought her a bundle of pecans and talked of weather and crops. Emma listened more than she spoke, hearing echoes of the land's old wisdom in their voices. She began to understand what her mother had always tried to teach her, to live in respect, not fear, to accept what she could not change, to hold wonder close. One evening, as she sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, Emma found herself speaking to the fading light. Thank you, she whispered, not sure who she addressed. Her mother, Salem, the land itself, or whatever had watched over her that night in the woods. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for not giving me all the answers. A soft breeze lifted her hair. Somewhere, in the growing dark, she thought she saw a shadow move at the edge of the pasture. A horse-shaped flicker, half in this world, half in another. Emma smiled, unafraid. True wisdom comes from accepting the unknown, she thought. Some mysteries test us, change us, and if we're lucky, make us humble and whole. Emma leaned back, letting the mystery settle inside her. She was finally at home, with the land, with the animals, with herself, and with all the questions that would never be answered. The days grew longer, softening the world with gentle warmth as summer pressed up against the ranch. Emma moved through her routines with new ease, her steps light, her heart unburdened by the weight she'd carried for so long. The memory of the night in the woods, of Salem's transformation and the choice she'd made, never quite faded, but instead of haunting her, it seemed to infuse each moment with quiet wonder. Life was still ordinary in so many ways, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Early mornings became her favorite time. Emma would wake just as the horizon blushed with the first hint of light, slip into boots and an old flannel, and walk out onto the porch with her coffee. The air was cool, sharp with the promise of a new day. She'd stand there, eyes half closed, listening to the gentle rustle of wind in the cottonwoods, the distant calls of birds, the soft nicker of horses in the barn. Sometimes, if she was lucky, a deer or two would graze at the edge of the yard, ghost-like in the mist. Salem was always the first to greet her. He'd wait at the gate, tail swishing, ears flicking toward her footsteps. There was no sign now of anything supernatural about him. No glowing eyes, no unnatural calm. Just the easy patience of a horse who'd found his home. Emma would scratch his neck, brush his coat, and whisper, "Good morning, old friend," knowing that whatever had passed between them would never quite be spoken aloud. The ranch itself seemed to heal with her. Weeds receded as she tended the gardens and fields. The other horses grew healthy and bold, their skittishness around Salem long forgotten. Emma repaired fences, repainted the barn doors, let laughter fill the house again, especially on quiet afternoons when she'd sit with a book or write in her journal. She found herself humming as she worked, songs her mother had sung, tunes she'd made up on the spot, little offerings to the silence of the land. Yet even as Emma reclaimed the routines of daily life, she did so with a new humility. She no longer felt the need to control every outcome, to demand certainty where none existed. There were days when things went wrong. The tractor wouldn't start. A sudden storm flattened the vegetable beds. A horse came up lame. But instead of letting frustration tighten around her, Emma would pause, breathe, and accept what was. She'd learned to listen, to the horses, to the earth, to the quiet pulse of her own instincts. Neighbors noticed the change. Mrs. Haywood stopped by more often, drawn by Emma's calm presence and ready ear. She'd bring jars of preserves, gossip, and sometimes old stories about the land and the people who'd lived there long before any of them. Emma listened with genuine interest now, not dismissing the tales as superstition, but hearing the deeper truths woven through them about respect, patience, and living lightly on the earth. Some evenings, Emma would sit on the porch long after dark, her mother's diary on her lap, the pages falling open to familiar sketches and notes. She'd reread her favorite passages, tracing her mother's handwriting with gentle fingers. Sometimes, when the wind picked up just right. She imagined she could hear her mother's voice, steady and wise. Not every answer needs to be found. Sometimes the greatest gift is the courage to live with questions. That message became Emma's guiding star. She stopped searching for explanations about Salem, about the things she'd seen in the woods, about the whispers she sometimes thought she heard at the edge of sleep. Instead, she let those mysteries enrich her life, coloring each day with possibility. She respected the land's secrets, cared for her animals with even greater tenderness, and trusted herself to meet each moment as it came. One golden morning, as she led Salem out to pasture, Emma paused at the edge of the woods. The sunlight streamed through the branches, turning the leaves to stained glass. She stood very still, letting the warmth wash over her, breathing in the scent of earth and grass. Salem nudged her gently, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw a shadow flicker just beyond the trees, a shape she recognized, both horse and not horse. A guardian or a friend, impossible to name but real all the same. She smiled, feeling no fear, only gratitude. Life, she realized, was not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be lived. She was stronger now, rooted in the land and in herself, connected to her past, her animals, and the world's enduring mystery. She no longer needed every question answered. Instead, she cherished the not knowing, the sense that anything was possible if she remained open and present. Emma returned to the house as the sun lifted higher, the fields glowing green and gold. She made breakfast, fed the horses, tended the garden. Simple acts, all of them, but each one meaningful. She found deep joy in the ordinary, a foal's first steps, the laughter of friends on the porch, the smell of rain after a dry spell. And when loneliness or sorrow touched her again, as it inevitably did, Emma welcomed those feelings too, knowing they were part of the story. Proof that she was alive and capable of loving deeply. She no longer pushed the pain away, but let it move through her, learning and growing with each passing season. On a quiet evening, Emma sat on the porch, watching the sun set in streaks of crimson and violet. Salem grazed in the fading light, his shadow long and serene at the edge of the woods. Emma closed her eyes, her heart full. Some mysteries walk beside us, she thought, not to be feared, but honored. And sometimes, the greatest peace comes not from certainty, but from the courage to live in wonder. She smiled, and in that moment, Emma knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Rooted, grateful, open to the world's questions, and unafraid of all she could never explain.